The orchestrator of the universe, Ego Jinpachi, goes one-on-one against Empty Void Eyes Hugo, a matchup between two of the smartest characters in the show. But this is not a clash of players, because in today's video we are going to explore both characters' philosophies, their way of thinking and how they view the world, in order to determine who has the ultimate mentality in Blue Lock. Ego Jinpachi. To understand Blue Lock in of itself, one must understand the man behind it, or I should say the man who built it out of nothing. You see, to put it simply, Ego is not a coach. He might be a leader, but he is definitely not a manager. Because you see, Ego is the embodiment of a philosophical extremist. He treats every moment he gets, every waking second he has with the Blue Lockers, as an opportunity to teach them about ego, about success, and about how to break through. However, don't get things twisted here. Just because Ego is a philosophical extremist does not mean that he doesn't care about the Blue Lockers. In fact, it is pretty much the opposite. He cares very deeply about everyone in the program, and as such, to me, he always gave the vibes of a strict parent, or in better words, a traditional father. A father that is very harsh on you, but you understand that it is for your own good. I mean, the perfect example of this would be his interaction with Nagi at the end of the NEL, even though Jinpachi wipes the floor with Nagi due to his half-assed motivation. Not Nagi, not Ryo, not even Isagi ended up hating or resenting Ego, all because even though he was harsh on Nagi, everything he said was for his own good. And in fact, Nagi himself defended him days later. And so, as I said, even as some of the Blue Lockers are failing, Ego actually takes the time to give them one last lesson. However, and going back to him being an extremist, he does not do this only because he cares about the Blue Lockers. At the end of the day, he has his own motivation and his own ego, which is to produce the best striker. However, how does he go about this? How does he go about turning coal into diamonds? Well, that's actually the most important point to talk about, because next let's actually define what is Ego's core belief. You see, while making this video and while researching how Ego thinks, I actually ended up realizing that Ego might be the smartest person in Blue Lock. It actually might not be neither Snuffy nor Hugo, and this is because of two intertwined reasons. The first is actually the more obvious one. Ego Jinpachi is ironically always pushing for an infinite ego. Your desire must have no bounds. You need to thrive for nothing but to be the best in the world, and you need to kill whatever version of you that is not working towards that goal. However, that's actually the second reason why I think he is a genius. He always pushes for the narrative of how results are the only things that matter in Blue Lock. However, Ego is more interested in the process of attaining those results more than the results themselves. Think about it with me for a second. Why would Ego explain concepts like luck and flow instead of explaining busted weapons like Metavision and the Predator Eyes? Well, you see, because the concept of luck and flow are means to an end. They are a state of mind that the player could attain in order to reach a new height, which means they are the process that produces the results. While on the other hand, the Predator Eyes and Metavision are weapons that define the results attained by the player. Isagi and Baro needed to go into flow, and they needed a lot of processes in order for both of them to attain the next level, which is defined by their ocular abilities. Ego actively explained to his players the flow state and luck, in order to get them in the right mindset and see who would actually come on top. And the result of that came in the form of Isagi utilizing both luck and flow in order to attain Metavision at the end of the U20 game and score the finishing blow. However, the biggest confirmation for all of this is actually the reproducibility point. Ego never cares about once in a lifetime kind of results. That's why he despised Nagi's 5-stage volley. That's why someone like Baro or Ren always fit in Blue Lock, because they embody the process in order to attain reproducible results. Baro's whole mentality is about going through trials in order to attain the #1 spot. He doesn't account for miracles, he doesn't care about flashiness. All Baro thinks about is how I can attain that level and how I can actually keep it and dominate in it. That's why he never had an issue shedding and evolving to a better player. He did it in the second selection, he did it in the U20 game, and he did it in the Ubers game. However, that's precisely how the second point of how the process matters more than the results align with the first point, that is all about how Ego is only the facade to Jinpachi's true mentality and core belief. And this is because I feel feel like Jinpachi utilizes ego as just the driving force. And don't get things twisted here. I'm not saying that ego doesn't matter or Jinpachi doesn't care about it. No, that's not what I'm talking about at all. What I am saying is that Jinpachi utilizes ego in order to push his players towards his desired philosophy, which could be summarized by two words: infinite adaptability. You see, ego believes that the player is not fixed. They are not defined and they are not finished. In fact, it's the total opposite. Anyone can become a striker if they have a strong ego for it. However, the process of attaining that result and how ego pushes you towards that has everything to do with adaptability. Much like he said it back in the second selection, receiving losses is just part of life, and it is how the player reacts to said losses that determines whether they succeed or not later in the future. And to be honest guys, I truly love this, and this moment here honestly just changed my life, because facing adversity is just part of living, and it is not about whether you face them or not, but it is about how you deal with them when they happen. And this is where ego matters a lot, because it's that infinite desire, that unyielding fire within you that pushes you to break through the setbacks and the losses. It is because Baro has an infinite ego that he was able to break through. It is because of that Rin decided to go berserk in the U20 game, even though in that moment all Isagi and the Blue Lockers did was help Rin beat his brother. However, the unyielding fire within him to be the one to destroy Sai pushed against that, which is funny because it turned what would be a wholesome moment in any other regular anime into one of the moments that truly cemented Blue Lock as a philosophical masterpiece. And I feel like since I spoke of Baro, let's actually talk about the players that thrive more in Ego's system. Players like Rin, Isagi, Baro, and Kaiser who constantly change in order to constantly feed their egos. However, even a player like Shido who constantly seeks the next big explosion fits perfectly with Jinpachi's mentality. As long as you keep pushing yourself forward and as long as your ego is quite literally bottomless, then by definition you get the green light from ego. And this is funny because at the beginning of Blue Lock, the guys with the biggest ego were meant for that program. That's why players like Rin and Baro found it very easy to succeed within Blue Lock. However, someone like Isagi needed to reawaken his old ego that was sealed in order to succeed in Blue Lock. And this point actually is one of the reasons why I said Ego is one of the smartest characters in the show. You see, as I said, Ego is all about an extreme environment that leads to favorable results. And in fact, this was shown in the first competition within Blue Lock. The first few minutes of Blue Lock where Kira got eliminated were complete craziness. And that environment pushed an extreme egoist like Bachira to bloom, but also reawakened someone like Isagi. And that's the genius of Ego, because he understood that the perfect way in order to teach these high schoolers how to succeed is by throwing them in literal hell, and only those who survive from it are meant to achieve the highest of levels. However, and up until this point, none of this screams extremism. In fact, if anything, this is a good lesson that someone needs to follow in order to succeed. You need to have the infinite desire and the ability to always adapt in order to reach the result you truly desire. However, where things get a little bit sketchy with Ego is with how narrow-minded the end goal is, because even within Blue Lock, there are actually only few players who care about being the #1 striker. I mean, for every Rin, Baro, Isagi, Shido, Otoya, and Yuki, we have players like Nico, Karasu, Aiko, or Gagamaru who don't really care about being the best striker. In fact, someone like Nico found his ultimate ego in crushing strikers that are actively trying to destroy his system and his team. And this is where I feel Ego completely goes to the extreme, because even though Nico is playing as a defender and his ultimate ego is blooming in that position, Jinpachi still expects him to go and be a striker still, which honestly is just odd and sometimes feels out of place, because everything that Ego told the Blue Lockers could be used against him. Think about it for a second. If you are meant to adapt and constantly evolve in order to reach the vision that your ultimate ego is describing, then what if that ego is not about being the best striker? What about if that ego is about being the ultimate artist on the field? I mean, someone like Levi, who would definitely succeed in Blue Lock, doesn't really care about who is the #1 player. In his mind, he is the most expressive player and thus he is the best. In fact, even the current best player in the world, Noah, doesn't really care about it that much. All Noah cares about is to face strong opponents and push himself to his absolute best. Whether this entails being the best striker or not, he simply does not care. And in all honesty, sometimes I feel like he is in contradiction with himself. For example, take his interaction with Karasu. He told him that anyone who is doing anything for the sake of the team is absolute trash, which I definitely agree with. One must seek his own strength in order for society to be strong, and it is the same for a football team. France is not strong as a team. It is strong because every individual player in it is completely busted. Even NPCs are given hard time for the blue lockers. And so Ego is absolutely right. However, think about it. What if Karasu doesn't want to be a striker? What if Karasu fights for a different reason? Does that mean that he should follow Ego still and still try to score, or should he follow his own desire and what his ego is telling him and still only take the adaptability point out of Jinpachi's philosophy? Well, that's actually the first contradiction. The second is that Blue Lock by its nature has defenders and a goalkeeper. And I know I explained it with Nico before, but what about these players? What about Gagamaru? Do you still expect him to leave his post and go and try and score? The other team would simply just shoot the ball from afar. And as I said, focusing on your own goal no matter the situation works for certain players like Baro, Shido, Rin, Isagi, Yuki, and Otoya. Even though most of them still give passes when they are forced, at the end of the day they are all still aiming for their own goal. However, again, what if the player has a different desire? What if the player, much like for example Hiyori, is aiming to attain a different dream? I mean, since I brought Hiyori, remember back in the Uber's game, Hiyori was completely split between what his parents wanted, between what Isagi wanted, and between what Ego wanted. I mean, the brainwashing was so strong to the point where even though he was about to pass to Isagi, Ego showed up in his mind and forced him to take a shot. However, as we all learned that Hiyori doesn't really care about being the best striker. I mean, sure, he scored against France, but that was only because the situation got really desperate and Karasu was able to conjure a different attack pattern. When the smoke is settled, Hiyori still wants to be the best producer for the best striker in the world. He doesn't want to be the #1 player, he wants to be the world's second best. In any case, however, to conclude with Ego Jinpachi, he is a philosophical extremist that is all about an infinite ego that fuels constant adaptability in order for the player to reach his ultimate dream. However, the extreme part of it is that he believes that the ego should be only represented by those who strive to be the best strikers in the world. And to be frank with you guys, this has to be one of the best mentalities you can adapt in order to go really far in life. Obviously not the best striker in the world point, but everything else is definitely perfection. However, can this constantly mutating philosophy actually beat natural selection personified? Empty void eyes, the true leader of France and the man behind the suitability theory. To Hugo, things are not so different from what Ego actually believes, because much like the latter, Hugo also believes that one must strive to reach the best version of themselves. However, contrary to the philosophical extremist, Hugo does it completely differently. He does it through his suitability theory, which states that in order to reach the best version of yourself, one must lean to their strength. In another sense, much like Ego, Hugo's philosophy is also about breaking through the walls. It is the same as in you need to face your problems and you need a path to force your way through. However, for Ego, it's not done only through willpower. Instead, much like he said, it is first done by identifying your natural ability and your suitability. Then you break the wall by leaning into that suitability and your strength completely. That's how you push yourself to the limit. That's how you face and overcome every problem life throws at you. And please understand, his philosophy is different from fleeing. It is not about chasing the suitable environment for you to thrive. Instead, it is about leaning to your own suitability from within in order to react to any environment you find yourself in. And I don't know what to tell you guys, much like Ego's philosophy, this has to be one of the best philosophies to attain success in life. And this statement by me right here actually matters a lot for when we are about to decide which mentality is better. So please keep it in mind. However, and since I brought Ego into the conversation, let's talk about where he was mistaken in regards to Hugo's mentality. Because while explaining to Karasu that Hugo's mentality would only push the physically apt players to perform, he actually proved that he completely misunderstood what Hugo meant. Because you see, Hugo's suitability is not just about the physical traits. Of course, they are included within it. However, it also includes the mental traits and even your own ego and how it is expressed. For example, of course, Hugo accounts for speed, strength, and reflexes, and if any player has any of these, it would be stupid not to utilize them to the fullest. But at the same time, Hugo understands that they are not the only traits that he needs to take into account, because much like Isagi deducted, Hugo also accounts for IQ, decision making, and all sorts of mental weapons. In fact, I even think he accounts for ocular abilities and special weapons like that, because he was able to utilize Charles' insane awareness in order to stop Isagi before. And so what Ego said about him accounting only for the physical aspect is definitely completely wrong. Sure, that's the case with players like Leiden and Loki, however, for players like Charles or even Hugo himself, he does not just rely on the physicality. In fact, as we are discovering in the latest chapters, Loki himself has an insane perception, and so even with an extreme example like him, it is still not just about physicality and his speed. And actually, in order to explain this further for you guys, I will give you examples from Blue Lock that fit perfectly with Hugo's mentality. The first and the most obvious player is definitely Shido, because Shido has one of the best reflexes in the world, and because his instincts are always sharp. He fits perfectly as a wild card that is very hard to contain. On the other hand, someone like Kaiser with that sharp mind, those predator eyes and the Kaiser impact, he fits perfectly as a punisher. He fits as a player that if you give him half a chance would punish you to no end. At the same time, someone like Isagi or Charles or Hugo himself, who have insane metavision and insane field readability. They are definitely fit to control spaces and dominate from the shadows. On the other hand, someone like Renambaro are fit to create and dominate chaos. And so even though they've never met Hugo and they've never interacted with a philosophy that is similar to his, by their nature, fully egotistical players tend to lean into their strength and their suitability. And so in a sense, Hugo's mentality is just real, and no matter what Ego can say about it, there is no escaping it. One performs better when he is in suitability, when you are utilizing your strength points to the fullest, and when you are managing your weak points, you tend to perform better and actually can reach the best version of yourself. And this is where the clash happens between Hugo and Ego, because Ego believes that everyone should strive to be the #1 striker, while Hugo simply doesn't care about what you want. He simply tells you that you need to play to your strong points in order to achieve whatever your heart desires. And I know what you might say, he is telling Isagi to be the second best, even though the latter truly desires to be the #1 striker. And so how does that work? Well, Hugo actually never told Isagi not to be a striker. He just told him not to be in charge. He told him not to be in the front lines and to control things from the shadows. Now, I've already made a full video on this, and honestly, the more I delve into Hugo's mentality, the more I think that video is definitely correct. However, the gist is that if Isagi is all about controlling the spaces with his metavision and his high perception, why would he constantly put himself in a position where a lot of players could counter him? Instead, he should play into that strong point and work things from the shadow, controlling everyone from a position they did not expect. Exactly how he did it in the Manshine City game. He gave the leading role to someone like Noah, while him and Corona worked from the shadows. And so I honestly believe that's what Hugo meant. You don't really need to be the leading striker. You could work things from the shadows. And it is interesting because Isagi himself felt the weight of being #1. I mean, for someone like Ren and Baro, it never really bothered them, because they both can be in the front lines. And for the case of Baro, he works both in the front line and from the shadows. However, for someone like Isagi, it is best to work things from the shadow entirely, and to control everyone and everything on the field in order to attain the best results possible. And to be honest, the example of Isagi is just the perfect representation of what Hugo is saying. And as I said, his mentality is one of the healthiest in Blue Lock, and it is one that is very applicable in real life in order to achieve the highest forms of success. However, can natural selection personified defeat the unyielding fire of Ego Jinpachi? For how this matchup would go, I gotta say that it is the most interesting matchup I've had on the channel. Before, it's usually pretty concrete. Even if the players are close, we have feats and we have statements in order to decide who is better. However, the thing with mentalities, they honestly could be both right, and they could be right to the same degree, and thus it makes it really hard for us to judge which is the best mentality. At the end of the day, even though Jinpachi is an extremist, his mentality is still very crucial in order to attain success. And so how would this matchup would go? I'm not just going to tell you that they are equal and that there is no winner of this contest. Well, of course no. Let's first talk about why these two mentalities actually can work together and why a hybrid between the two might actually be the best mentality in the show, where you first need to identify your end goal and you need to have that unyielding fire and that bottomless ego in order to reach it. At the same time, as you do that, you need to be aware of your own strengths and weaknesses and need to work towards your strong points while mitigating the negative effects of your weak points. And to be honest, after the loss that Japan would actually suffer at the hands of France, I feel like ego might actually consider certain aspects from Hugo's mentality, specifically how you need to leverage your suitability in order to push further. And this actually leads me to another point. You see, first it was Kira, and then it was Boratsuta, and now it is Hugo, where a lot of characters are calling ego's mentality as brainwashing. And while I don't necessarily agree with it for the most part, I can definitely see it, especially in regards to the point of everyone needing to strive to be the best striker in the world. And in fact, this point specifically is what's going to lead us in order to determine which is the best mentality. Because much like I explained before, there are a lot of players who don't care about being the best striker. Again, for every Baro there is Hiyori, for every Isagi there is Nico. And I understand there are players who were forced into that position like Aiku, but to be honest, someone like Gagamaru seems to be in his happy place. Sure, he was striving to be the best striker. However, ever since he was put as a goalkeeper, he has actually been performing much better than what he did as a striker, and the same goes for Nico, for Karasu. In fact, someone like Nico, even before Ego put him as a defender, actually found it very fun to stop strikers from scoring. And in fact, Nico leads me to another point, and this one I feel like Ego here is kinda hypocritical, because he put Nico there, he put him as a defender, he put Karasu as a defensive midfielder, yet he still expects them to score for some goddamn reason. I mean, I would get it if he told the entire front line to try and score all for themselves. However, him and Isagi even expect Gagamaru to score. I don't know. To be honest, it's kinda weird and I don't like it here. However, the biggest killer to this extreme form of ego's theory is actually Kunigami. Kunigami was built like Noah. He was built with the physical suitability in order to become the best striker in the world. Yet, because he doesn't have Noah's rational eye, or more importantly, he doesn't have his infinite ego, Kunigami actually failed as a striker in the Uber's game. And Ego himself told him to kill the desire to be the #1 striker and instead become selfless for the team, which is something that he actually advocated against with Karasu. And Kunigami exposes another point, which is when Ego said that everything becomes about physicality if we go towards suitability. Well, that's not the case, and again, Kunigami is the perfect example. The guy was one of the most dominant strikers, yet he failed. However, he found great success in being a defensive midfielder and more importantly being an anchor and the hero for the team. And so, even though his physicality would have allowed him to be the best striker, it simply didn't, because the lack of ocular ability, because his mental aptitude towards it. Regardless of the reason, at the end of the day, Kunigami failed as a striker and succeeded as an anchor for the team despite him having the best physicality to be a striker. And so once more, I feel like Ego did not really understand Hugo's philosophy. And to be honest, he kinda started to contradict himself a lot, especially with Nico and Kunigami's cases. And so for that reason, and in all honesty, I feel like Hugo's mentality is definitely more stable and definitely more applicable in real life, as not only does it have a much more tangible way in order to achieve results, which means more reproducibility, but also it doesn't contain a lot, if any, contradictions like Ego's mentality. And honestly, if Ego did not have that focus on being a striker, no matter where you are on the field point of view, I honestly would have found it much harder to dictate which is better. However, because Ego's mentality has weaknesses, I definitely think that Hugo's mentality is the winner today and the one walking with the W. However, that's all I've got for you today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this special edition of the Matchups videos, and until next time, thank you for watching.